So we notice a couple of things here. We see this description of sin, which is exactly this. That temptation comes, that lust comes, and we go for it. It finds fertile ground in our souls, and then it gives birth to sin. The plant grows. But we also see something else here. It says clearly that God cannot be tempted by evil. And that seems to contradict something we're told about Jesus in Hebrews chapter 4 and in verse 15. In Hebrews 4 in verse 15, we read, "For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses." This is talking about Jesus in his role of high priest, of interceding for mankind with God. "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who cannot sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who has been tempted in all things as we are, yet without sin." Oh, wait a second. James just told us that God cannot be tempted by evil. And yet here in Hebrews we see Jesus, who is God, being tempted in all ways such as we are, and yet without sin. How can that be? Isn't that a contradiction? Well, why did Jesus not sin? Was it because he exercised enormous self-control and enormous self-discipline? Well, I'm sure Jesus did have enormous self-control and enormous self-discipline, but so did Paul, and so did Job, and so have others. And if we could attain this kind of victory over sin by our own human effort, well, we wouldn't need God for this business plan. But that's not why Jesus was not tempted with evil, but yet was tempted with evil. What do we mean by this contradiction? Well, it helps if we understand that in English at least, we tend to use the word tempted in two distinct ways. One way we might call external temptation, when something is put in front of us and then we have to choose whether we want to act on that or not, we might call that an external temptation. We could say, for example, the financial officer approached the accountant about embezzling corporate funds. And so here we see that we have the accountant, and we have the financial officer, and the financial officer tempts the accountant. So we'd say the financial officer tempted the accountant to embezzle corporate funds, but the accountant was not interested. So the temptation comes, and the accountant can choose to let it take root in himself, or he can choose to reject it. External temptation. On the other hand, we sometimes use tempt in the sense of what we might call internal temptation. We could say the accountant noticed the large corporate profits and the lax corporate security and was tempted to embezzle corporate funds. In this case, the temptation is not coming from without. The temptation is coming from within the accountant, who by definition has now given fertile ground to it. He's contemplating this temptation that is coming from within to embezzle corporate funds. He can still choose to reject it. But do we see how this is an internal temptation as opposed to the external one presented by the financial officer? So when we look at Jesus, we see that indeed he was tempted in this external sense. In fact, one of the famous accounts of the Bible is when Jesus is baptized by John the Baptist and driven by the Spirit, he goes out into the wilderness and fasts for 40 days and 40 nights. And then the devil himself comes and directly tempts Jesus. Now Jesus was a human, just as all of us are human. He was a man. He got hungry, he was thirsty, he would be cold, he could hurt, he certainly had testosterone flowing through his veins. And so there were all these temptations that could be put before him. Satan puts the temptations before him to make the stones bread because he's hungry, or to throw himself off the temple pillar and have God rescue him. Or he puts before him all the kingdoms of the earth and says, you can have all of these if you'll worship me. Temptations to power, to glory, to self-exaltation, to who knows what. But Jesus did not sin in any of them despite this external temptation. Why? Because within Jesus there was no fertile ground for sin to take root. It would be the furthest thing from his mind to put himself before love. To choose self over love. To choose self over the will of the Father or over what is good for other people. Completely foreign to him to look at other people and treat them as objects for consumption, which we certainly do in our society. We take people and we treat them as objects to be consumed, whether it's consuming them financially, consuming them visually, consuming them sexually. We consume people like objects. That was the furthest thing from Jesus' mind. It would never, ever occur to Jesus. It would never be enticing to him to exalt himself over love. He would always choose love because that was his nature. Now, some might say in the Garden of Gethsemane, isn't Jesus being selfish here, trying to preserve his life? And when we see it, no, absolutely not. In fact, it illustrates just the opposite. For those, again, unfamiliar with the life and death of Jesus, in the Garden of Gethsemane, this is what happens just before Jesus is taken captive. Indeed, he is captured in the Garden of Gethsemane. He's just had his final meal with his disciples. He's been very, very close in instructing them. He shares his body and blood and bread and wine as an eternal memorial of his death that he's about to suffer. And then he takes his disciples out to the Mount of Olives, goes to this Garden of Gethsemane, takes his closest disciples, James and John and Peter, and then goes on and prays by himself in this very, very intense prayer, knowing what is going to happen to him, knowing they're going to take him and beat him, knowing they're going to take him and scourge him, that they're going to nail him to a cross and he is going to die by a Roman crucifixion. And so you can imagine all of this coming at Jesus. And who knows what else is coming at him from direct temptations by Satan, by the assault that is upon all of his senses, perhaps, as some have speculated, seeing all the sins of humanity. And yet, is he going to die for all of these people who do all of these atrocities that are before him? So we see all of these physical and psychological inputs coming at him to preserve his life, to preserve his flesh, to avoid pain, to avoid rejection and ridicule and a humiliating death. Humiliating those around him, his mother, his family, his disciples. But how does Jesus process these inputs? Remember, the inputs are not sin. They're just neutral. They're just normal inputs. What does he do? Well, we see this in the Gospel according to Mark, in chapter 14, and verse 36. And as Jesus is processing all of these inputs, he falls down in this intense prayer before God, and he says, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. That's not Jesus being selfish. That's Jesus showing us as the example of how to be a human being in a divine way. Of how to be a human being without sin. He's processing these inputs. And these inputs are there that would say, I want to preserve my life. But yet it would be the furthest thing from him to ever think to preserve his own life as opposed to love. To preserve his own life in opposition to his love for God the Father and the Father's will. We can explain it this way.